seasonality in breeders, as well as the steps in ovulation. So there's a lot of complexity with some of the stuff we're going to talk about. A lot of slides, but there's going to be a few slides, and you'll know which ones they are, that I'm going to highlight more than anything and spend the most amount of time on. And that's the one you need to think about as you are starting to study for the next exam. At the end of class today, I'll give back the exams. I'm not going to necessarily go over them. I'll have the key up there. You've already got your grades posted, so I'll give those back, and we'll comment a little bit and move on from there. All right, so we're going to talk about the estrous cycle. Now let's define that term, even though you should already know it. Let's redefine it. What is the estrous cycle?
OUS is the whole cycle from start to end, and estrous US is the receptivity to the male.
Okay, now go back to that first thing you said, from start to end. What does that mean? Be more specific. The period of time from estrus to estrus. The period, that's the estrous cycle, the period of time from an estrus to the next estrus. And we're not going to go through all those different lengths of the estrus cycle and all the different species, because I would assume you know that already. I would hope stuff you hopefully learn in animal science. As we think about the estrus cycle, I want you to think about however it's easier for you to think about. Whether it is a straight line with different phases to it, or it's a circle with different phases or pie shapes cut out of it. Whatever helps you understand that it is a cycle. And assuming the animal is normal physiology, assuming the animal doesn't become pregnant, all that, and she's not seasonal, all that stuff in the plan is, what's the estrous cycle going to do in a spontaneous ovulator, which is most animals we deal with. If she doesn't become pregnant, if she's normal physiology, normal management, what's her estrous cycle going to do? It's a cycle. It's going to keep going over and over and over and over again. It's going to repeat over and over and over again. Now, what can interrupt that? What can interrupt this estrous cycle repeating over and over again?
Pregnancy.
Pregnancy. We'll talk about that. What else can interrupt it?
Sickness.
Anything related to physiology, poor management, anything like that could interrupt it. What else could interrupt it?
Environment.
Okay. Could be environment. What about seasonal breeders?
Yeah.
That kind of interrupts it because they are only cyclical during certain times of the year.
Photo period.
Do what? What did you say?
Would photo period be one?
That would relate to the seasonal breeders, and we'll get into that again. Now, we won't talk about it today, but we'll talk about it. We will briefly mention it today. We'll talk about the bitch a little bit because the bitch is unique in the fact that her estrous cycle, the in-child process is very, very long. We're talking months. Whereas typically the length of the estrous cycle in most of the animals we deal with is what? Days. What's the length of the estrous cycle in the cow? Roughly about 21 days, right? So the bitch is different. So the way she works is a little bit different relative to her period of what we call anestrus, and we'll get to that later. Okay, so you can start anywhere you want to. Whether you want to do it a straight line, whether you want to do a circle, it doesn't matter. But keep in mind, estrous cycle starts and goes. Now, things can interrupt it, but it's going to start and go. I'm going to pick estrus as the phase to start with. You can start with any phase you want to because you're going to come back to that same phase eventually. But let's talk about estrus first, since that's the one you're most familiar with as a phase of the estrus cycle. Because the estrus cycle is divided in phases. Estrus tends to be, in some animals, the shortest phase. In some animals, it may not necessarily be the shortest phase. It depends on the animal. And not every animal is going to have every one of these phases. And we'll differentiate that as we go through. So let's talk about each one of these phases. And I want you to key on two things. One is, what is the predominant structure on the ovary? And related to that, what is the principal hormone? And when I say hormone, I'm only talking about one here. We're talking about estrous cycle. We're talking about females, right? The males, we're done with males for a while. I'm talking about females here. So, as we think about these, I want you to think about what's the predominant structure. Now, it could be a structure developing on the follicle. Or it could be a structure that is fully functioning on the follicle. What's the predominant structure and what hormone related to that structure is the predominant hormone during these phases? Now, estrus should be easy without you even thinking about it because we've talked about it so much. Let's jump ahead briefly. What's the predominant hormone in estrus? Estrogen, right? Because we've talked about over and over again that estrogen causes sexual receptivity. And estrus is that period of sexual receptivity. So, going back to what we've already talked about, if estrogen is the predominant hormone in estrus, then what would be the predominant structure on the ovary? These structures on the ovary are what? Are making the hormones, by the way. So go back. You got to go back. What's making estrogen? Granulosa cells of a follicle. So the primary structure is a follicle. It may not be a fully functioning follicle yet, early estrus, but it is a follicle developing. You've got folliculogenesis. Growing follicle means more granulosa cells, means more circulating estrogen in estrus. Now, how long is the estrus cycle? But we're not going to get into all these with all these species. I'm not going to spend time on that. You can look that stuff up if you don't already know it. But just to give you an idea, what is the length of estrus, not the cycle, but ESTRUS, the period of sexual receptivity in, say, a cow? And it certainly varies from individual to individual and between Bos taurus and Bos indicus. I give you that. But what, generally speaking, is it? A few hours. 12 hours, 18 hours. What is the length of estrus, ESTRUS, in, say, the sow? Period of sexual receptivity. Like 9 days. So the point is you can have a fairly big range of times relative to the length of estrus. In other words, certain females can be sexually receptive for a long period of time relative to others. A bitch is another one. The length of estrus in the bitch can be several days. And we'll talk more about that. Okay. So estrus is, again, that period of sexual receptivity. Now, one thing that we need to differentiate, though, that some people can get confused on, is when ovulation takes place in these different phases. In most of our species, ovulation takes place in estrus. It could be in the middle of estrus, it could be towards the end of estrus. Let me just ask you a somewhat hypothetical, maybe not really hypothetical. Why does ovulation never occur at the beginning of estrus? Why does ovulation never occur at the beginning of estrus?
It'd be too early.
The follicles still maturing.
Yeah, the estrogen levels are low. It wouldn't make any sense, right? Because you don't have very much sexual receptivity. The female's not going to be that interested in early estrus, so why would one ovulate? It makes no physiological sense to do that. Okay. So most of the time, ovulation is going to be mid-estrus or into late estrus. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. The bovine is one of them, and caprine, do we know what caprine is? Goats, okay. So cattle, goats, there are exceptions to when ovulation takes place. Ovulation typically in those species takes place in the next phase, which is mid-estrus. And mid-estrus tends to be fairly short, just a few days, not that long. And not every animal has mid-estrus. Now, this is one exception to it. Not every animal is going to have a mid-estrus. In fact, many do not have a mid-estrus. But when it comes to the species we deal with the most reproductively, which of course is the cattle, they do have mid-estrus. Bovine, sheep and goats, they also have a mid-estrus phase. So in the, do what?
Sorry, is mid-estrus like at the beginning or end? Like when, as far as like ovulation, when is mid-estrus?
Well, remember these are phases. So we've got estrus, now we move to the next phase. Now, when ovulation takes place in those phases depends on the species. If we look at, say, if this is estrus here, and this is, say, mid-estrus next to it, because that'd be the next phase, some species are going to ovulate. They may ovulate here or they may ovulate here. In the case of cattle, they're going to ovulate in early mid-estrus, about right there. In the case of goats are always a weird exception. They are kind of like they're right on the line. We typically give them credit for being in mid-estrus, but sometimes the doe can actually ovulate in really, really, really super early mid-estrus, or in fact even super late estrus. So there's a little bit of gray area there. So keep in mind these are phases, and it's just when ovulation is going to take place in the phase. So mid-estrus. Now, as we move into the next phase, again, we need to think about the predominant hormone, the predominant structure. If I've got ovulation taking place here, somewhere in here typically, or even in early mid-estrus, what is then going to be the predominant structure on the ovary? Not the follicle. Why? What did I just say?
Not there.
Ovulation is taking place here. So if ovulation takes place, there's no more follicles. The CL is developing. The key to med-estrus is it's a developing CL. It's going up, right? Developing. If CL is going up, thus is the predominant structure in med-estrus. What's the predominant hormone? Progesterone, because it's going up in response to the growing CL. Okay. So estrus and med-estrus. After that is diestrus. Now diestrus is the longest phase of the estrus cycle in all species. This is the one where the CL is going to reach full functionality, and it also, towards late diestrus, is where the CL is going to regress. This one's easy, though, relative to hormone structure. Obviously, the primary structure is the CL, and the primary hormone is progesterone. The highest levels of progesterone would be reached in diestrus. Don't confuse this, though. Diestrus is not pregnancy. Diestrus is just a phase of the estrus cycle. What would happen, though, if an animal were to become pregnant? Would she have a diestrus period? No, what would happen is we would go from, instead of having a diestrus period here, because normally it would be like that, and we'd have diet, well, that'd be much longer than that, but we'd have a diestrus period here. Instead of that, if she became pregnant, what would we have? We would have pregnancy. It would be way over here. What would the functioning CL be doing during pregnancy? What would the functioning CL be doing during pregnancy? It would be producing progesterone at a constant level through pregnancy. So if pregnancy were to take place, diestrus goes away and the animal becomes pregnant, but she just keeps producing progesterone on and on and on during pregnancy because that's the job of progesterone being produced by the CL. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Also, don't forget, in diestrus is when we start to see a drop in progesterone late in diestrus because the CL is going to start to regress. Again, these are part of the estrus cycle. If we have pregnancy interrupting it, that whole different dynamic comes into play. After diestrus, then we have proestrus, pro meaning before, obviously. So if it makes it easier, you want to start at proestrus here, it doesn't matter. It's always going to circle back around. So if this is diestrus here, and then we've got proestrus here. After proestrus, it's going to go all the way back and start over again at estrus. So if we have a regressing CL in diestrus, what's happening? If we have a regressing CL, by the way, what is causing, again, we're not talking about pregnancy yet, what is causing that CL to regress during diestrus or late diestrus? Prostaglandin F2 alpha, right? Thought you missed that on the exam. PGF2 alpha is produced by the uterus to say no pregnancy took place. Regress the CL, progesterone levels start to drop. If progesterone levels start to drop, what happens to the block on the hypothalamus? It goes away, the cyclicity starts back in proestrus, and so what would then be the predominant structure in proestrus? A follicle that's starting to grow. And if a follicle is growing, then estrogen levels are going to go up because obviously a follicle, the granulosa cells are producing the estrogen. Okay. I'm going to find my picture on the slide. None of you are impressed. None of you are impressed. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, the red Brahmin. That was just harkening back to my roots. What are you in that face for? From Florida. Anyway. Okay, so phases of the estrus. Are we done? Are we done with phases of the estrus cycle? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the species. In most of the species we're going to deal with in animal agriculture, we're done with it. We've got estrus, med-estrus, diestrus, and proestrus starts over again. Now, if an animal becomes pregnant, yeah, that's a different deal. If she's seasonal, that's a different deal. And we term that uniqueness of shutting off cyclicity and estrus, meaning no cyclicity or no estrus. And we're not going to get into this today, but here's what people get a little bit confused by. Are there examples, because this is the estrus cycle, we can keep going around and around or start over again. Are there examples of animals that we are going to intentionally shove this long anestrus period in here where it actually becomes part of their estrous cycle. Meaning if they never get pregnant, they're going to repeat over and over again, but within that repeating cycle, there's going to be this long phase of nothingness. And they're not seasonal. There is, and the bitch is that example. The bitch is the only example in domestic species where we have an intentional inclusion of an estrus period in their estrus cycle. So the length of the estrus cycle in the bitch is how long? We said the length of the estrus cycle in the cow is 21 days. What's the length of the estrus cycle in the bitch? Yeah, like 6-7 months. Why is it so long? Because part of that has a really long dead period where there is no cyclicity, and that's called anestrus. That's one example. Now, anestrus, though, typically would be related to other things that might happen along the way in the estrus cycle for most animals. Some is pretty obvious. If an animal becomes pregnant, she has entered anestrus, right? Why? She's pregnant. Progesterone levels are high, block on the hypothalamus, no cyclicity, right? That is anestrus. Pregnancy is a period of anestrus. Pretty obvious. What about seasonality? What I mean by that? Do what? Like photo period. So how does that affect anything? Right, there are some animals, you know this already, there are some animals that are cyclical in the short days. Short day breeders, right? What are our examples of short day breeders? Come on, y'all know this. Huh? Short day breeders? Chickens.
No, that's sheep and goats.
Oh, sheep and goats. Yes, small. Somebody scared me with this. I thought it said chickens. Okay. Sheep and goats, right? Short day. What's long day breeders? Meaning they are cyclical when the daylight, the photo period is long. Married, yeah.
Is that why female dogs who are not spayed are so subjected to getting a pyometra because of that huge anestrus cycle?
Yes. The simple answer to that question is yes. I'll just put it, we're going to get into the estrus cycle of the bitch a little bit more with the endocrinology of it. That'll be our probably last day of this week. But you'll start to understand, because the way the hormones work in the bitch are so much different, and what they do in the bitch are so much different than they are in any other species. So they're really an outlier when it comes to the estrus cycle. I like to talk about them, though, because they're unique with that long anestrus period. So those animals that are, say, are short day breeders, when are they in a normal anestrus period? Short day breeders are in normal anestrus when? When it's long days. Our long day breeders are in anestrus when? Short days, the fall and the winter time. Okay? That's their seasonal anestrus period. Can we manipulate that? Yeah, we do it for some animals. We do it with horses because horses are easy. We can manipulate that because we keep horses inside and control the light. What about sheep and goats? We can manipulate sheep and goats if we want to, but what does that mean? We've got to control the light. Well, if you're out in Wyoming and you got, 50,000 ewes, are you going to? You obviously don't do that. Okay, so there is some practicality to it as well. Now, some people can make the argument, and I wouldn't argue the point, that the queen is also a long day breeder, is seasonal. But there is no definitive answer to that question. Some queens will exhibit seasonality and some don't. So they're a bit of an oddball. Well, there's a lot about cats that are oddballs. They're a bit of an oddball when it comes to being true seasonality. So I hate to lump them into seasonal breeders yet. Big cause for weirdness. Lactation, what about that? Okay, she said some animals that are lactating will not cycle, which is partly true. Depends on animal. Quick question. Do all animals, I hate to use the word all, but for our discussion, our domestic species, do they all have some level of lactational anestrus? Yeah, they all have a little bit. What does that mean? When they start lactating, they typically are not cyclical right away, immediately. there's always going to be a little bit of, makes sense, right? Because she's trying to nourish this newborn, so she needs to conserve resources and doesn't necessarily need to cycle right away. But, and that's pretty much true of everything, but are there examples of species that have extremely strong lactational anestrus? In fact, complete lactational anestrus, meaning as long as they are lactating, they are not cyclical at all. Yes, and our example is what? The sow. Okay, the sow has a 100% complete lactational anestrus. She will not cycle as long as she's nursing. So how do we get a sow to cycle? We wean the pigs, and she stops lactating and she starts to cycle again. So they have a complete. Most animals have a partial lactational anestrus, that time when they are not cycling and they are lactating. And we'll look at some examples of that. Particularly, the queen is another little oddball when it comes to that. What about breeder species effects? Are there differences in anestrus periods or exhibiting anestrus based on different breeds or species? Well, yeah, there must be. I wouldn't have a slide, right? What's a good example? I always come back to it because when it comes to reproduction, they're screwy. They have other advantages, but species effects. Somebody asked me, it was in this class, somebody asked me about this. I think it's on the, Faith, did you ask me about this? On that table a long time ago that I said the stuff you should have known in animal science and whatever, talk about it. And it talked about Bos indicus having seasonality. Are Bos indicus seasonal? Not necessarily, but they will exhibit some anestrus or seasonal anestrus. That becomes a challenge if I'm trying to raise these animals because they are sometimes reproductive nightmares, and there's another issue relative to that because they can show some seasonality. They're not strong, but they can show some. We can see some different breed effects too relative to this. Certain breeds of a variety of breeds of dogs, breeds of cattle can exhibit some kind of, I don't hate to use the term true seasonality because it's not, but we can see some anestrus show up that we would prefer not to because when they are not cycling, they are obviously not going to be reproductively successful. So again, anestrus shows up. We've got some very defined periods of anestrus. Again, with the bitch, though, is the only exception where anestrus is actually part of her estrus cycle. Okay, everybody else is not part of their estrus cycle. Now, some of these diagrams we're going to show, a lot of these are easy stuff. So let's just put a figure to what we just talked about. Some of these species on here I could care less about. I don't even know why they're on here. But I want you to focus on those species that we talk about the most. What this shows, easy to define, this is concentration of estrogen. Everywhere we see this little spike of estrogen, again, we already know that that's not true representation of the way estrogen does, because that's more of a surge, and estrogen doesn't really surge, but let's just go with what we got. Every time we see that highest level of estrogen, what does that represent?
Ovulation.
Does it represent ovulation? This is estrogen. Every time we see that peak level of estrogen, what does that tell us?
Oh, then I have
Well, what does tell us? I agree. It will tell us the follicle is very large.
surge in GnRH.
Okay, I agree with that. It would cause a surge in GnRH and a surge in LH. But what does that tell us about the period of estrous cycle? Every time I see that highest level of estrogen, what phase of the estrous cycle am I in? Estrus. Okay. So the distance between each one of those little quote-unquote peaks is what? The length of estrus cycle. Okay. It's not like that. So on the top line is polyestrus. What does that mean? That means they are assuming normal physiology, all that stuff. They're maintained normally, managed normally, normal nutrition. They're going to cycle on a regular basis. Now, they didn't necessarily put days in here. They got the months at the bottom, and those can be argued a little bit. But basically what you see is regular pattern, polyestrus, over and over again of the estrous cycle. That's not assuming pregnancy and all that stuff. That's just showing a spontaneous ovulator like our cow, like the sow. I don't care about the queen. The queen shouldn't be in there anyway, in my opinion, because she's an induced ovulator. We'll talk more about the queen later on, but that's neither here nor there. So that would be representation of the cow in the south. Below that, obviously, is what? Look at the months at the bottom. When are we going to have cyclicity in these animals? If you didn't have this right here, you would say they are exhibiting estrus in spring, summer, so they are long day breeders. No, represent long day breeders. What about this? They are exhibiting estrus during the fall and winter, the short days. Okay. Now, what about this one? This is the odd duck here. And again, I don't care about the wolf. I don't care about the fox. I don't care about the. I mean, you can care about it. I don't nothing against it. That's not my deal. What about this dog thing? What does monoestrus mean? Do they really have one estrus cycle per year? That's what it means, right? One estrus cycle per year. Do they really? You're like, oh, something's not right. You just said 6 to 7 months. Something's not right. Why? And this is where it gets confusing. Why is this showing this? Why are they? And again, that's just a diagrammatical representation. There's a lot that can manipulate that. Why do we, from a classification standpoint, consider the bitch a monoestrus, means she has one estrus cycle per year?
Because they're so far apart.
Well, kinda. It's mathematical. Do the math. If we on average, and we'll use an average number with the bitch, about 7 months. What's 12 divided by 7? Anybody know off the top of their head? I don't know. What's 12 divided by 7? Like 1.7, 1.8. Guess what? What does it start with? A 1. That's serious. That's where that comes from. It's not 2. It's 1.7. So all that is math. Certainly a bitch can exhibit, especially a bitch that might have a 6-month estrus cycle. She's going to exhibit estrus 2 times a year. Okay? So that's where that comes from. So take that with a grain of salt, that many bitches are not going to only have one estrus per year. But what it does represent is you're not going to have many estri throughout a year because of that very long included anestrus period physiologically for those animals. And it kind of makes sense if you look at these animals here, particularly the bear. What does the bear do? She has one litter a year, so it makes more sense there. Okay, more easy stuff here. These are generic diagrams. These lines never look this perfect in the real world, but this is just now putting some hormones to these phases. So we'll start where we started on original discussion. There's estrus there. There's medestrus, so we know it's probably either cattle or goats in this case, or because it has a medestrus. There's diestrus, notice how long it is, and there's proestrus before beginning again. So that's what I'm talking about. It starts over and over and over again. Now this happens to be, I can tell you, a cow. How do I know that? Well, I know the author of the book, and this is a cattle guy. But I also notice where's ovulation taking place. Very early medestrus. That's that little green line right there. So let's just, and again, this is just real order. Talk about what's the predominant hormone in estrus?
Estrogen.
There's your estrogen right there. What's the predominant hormone in medestrus? Again, trending now. If it's going down, it's not predominant. If it's going up, it is. What's going up during medestrus? Progesterone, because the CL is starting to develop because we've had our ovulation already take place. So progesterone is going up. Progesterone reaches max level in diestrus, and then the CL starts to regress late diestrus. So again, the CL and progesterone are the predominant hormone in structure or structure hormone in diestrus. And then proestrus, same deal. Progesterone is going down, estrogen is going up. Because we got CL regression here, we take the block off the hypothalamus, so cyclicity starts back, folliculogenesis starts back, and then estrogen starts to increase during proestrus and reaches its max during estrogen. That's a very generic trend we're going to see. Again, it's going to look a lot different in an actual endocrine graph for an individual. Same deal here, we just added a couple different definitions. We can kind of create these umbrella terms for a couple of different phases, follicular phase and the luteal phase. So we've got the 3 phases we're going to work on primarily, but we can also define them relative to what the predominant structure is on the ovary. So, just like I already mentioned, what phases these on the board here that we're talking about are going to be included in the quote-unquote follicular phase. Meaning the phases where the follicle is the predominant structure would be estrus and proestrus, or proestrus, estrus, depending on how you want to go. And luteal phase refers to what? Metestrus, diestrus, why do we call it luteal? The CL is the predominant structure on the ovary. So it's just some different terminology there. So nothing too overwhelming. Now this, hint, this is an important diagram. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. And we may stop for today after this. Now, a couple things I want to go over with this diagram so you don't get confused. Don't get overly caught up in the length of these phases because it will throw you off. Because if I'm taking this at face value, what is it telling me about diestrus? If I'm taking it at face value here, what is it saying about diestrus here? Yeah, it's like 2 days. Well, we know that's not true. What are they doing to you here? Confusing you? Yeah. Well, they can. That's why I'm spending time on it. What they're doing to you is they are only giving you a little peek at diestrus. Because why? All of diestrus over here is way over here, sitting over here. What does it look like from a hormone standpoint? Exactly like it looks right there. So why are we going to include it? So they're condensing the graph. Does that make sense? So don't confuse that. It's saying, well, diestrus, he said diestrus is the longest period. It is. This diagram is just cutting it off because we don't need to talk about it because nothing's happening other than progesterone levels are the highest. And we know that. Okay. We need to, and also, by the way, net estrus can confuse you a little bit too because, again, some animals don't have it, but net estrus can vary a lot in its length, unlike some of these other phases. This is showing about a 3.5 day net estrus. Net estrus in some species can be 1 day up to like 5 days. So just be careful about that. But again, there's not a ton going on in net estrus relative to hormone levels. So that shouldn't freak you out too much. So the point being is that we need to concentrate on what's going on in proestrus. So let's define our lines first. And we're going to add to this graph. So we've got progesterone is this gold color. Estrogen is red. LH as orange, yellow, and then purple as FSH. Now, a lot of this we already know because we've talked about it. So let's take this phase at a time. Diestrus, of course, highest level of CL functionality with the beginning at the end of the regression of the CL. Again, as a review, what is causing at that point right there, if I could look at the ovary, at that point right there, what would I see happening? And this, by the way, as you learn this graph, that's what I want you to know. We're adding stuff to this. I want you to be able to tell me what's going on at these points. These lines tell you things that are happening physiologically. What do I know is going on right there? Okay, it is. What's happening to CL right there? Right there, it's what? It's fully functioning still. What's happening right there? It's starting to regress. How do I know it's regressing? Progesterone levels are going down. What's causing the regression? PGF2 alpha from the uterus is signaling there was no implantation. PGF2 alpha sends from the uterus to say start to regress and start over again. Okay. So that's what that is right there. That's regressive CL triggered by PGF2 alpha from the uterus. So progesterone levels are going down, we know that. In proestrus, estrogen levels are going up because this is taking the block off of the hypothalamus. So cyclicity can start back, folliculogenesis can start back, granulosa cells start to replicate, estrogen levels start to go up. We already know that. Notice this is very classic for estrogen. Notice it's not surging. Surge is that LH. That is not a surge. It's a rise, but it's not a surge. That's kind of what I was alluding to in previous classes, that some of these diagrams look like surges, but it's not. We've got a gradual increase in estrogen. Are we reaching our maximum estrogen levels during proestrus? No, because we want to reach our maximum level in estrus. Here's our maximum level of estrogen, obviously. Now the question is, and we'll add a couple things here. can you point out on here where, and you should be able to, can you point out where the threshold estrogen level is? Where is it? Let's back up so everybody's on the same page. Why am I keying in on the estrogen threshold?
Because as soon as estrogen hits its threshold, GnRH, it signals GnRH to do a surge to produce LH.
Well, trigger said that a little bit wrong, but it affects the surge center of the hypothalamus, causes a surge in GnRH, and then a subsequent surge in LH from the anterior pituitary, which GnRH is not on here. So, having said that then, how would I know, if I'm looking at this, I'm not looking at estrogen. What am I looking at to determine the threshold? LH. When do I see LH changing? Meaning, boom, something's happened, something dramatic has happened. Right there. See that little curve? That's where that surge is triggered, right there. So how do I know my maximum estrogen level? Well, I trace it, or my threshold level. I trace it back up, and roughly right there is my threshold level of estrogen. So it reached the threshold right there, and then at that point is where it triggered that surge. And the surge in GnRH is going to cause a subsequent surge in LH, but it happens very, very fast. One surge leads to another very, very quickly because of that hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Okay. Does that make sense? So identify the threshold level of estrogen here. Okay, so there's our surge in LH. Now, let's keep going. We'll come back to FSH, don't worry, but there's our surge in LH. What's the significance of that surge in LH? What's it going to initiate? Ovulation. But is it going to happen at that surge site or that point of the surge? No. Notice, and this is a great example of that lag time I was talking about. There's the surge, where's ovulation? Boom, over there. Look at that lag time. That's like a day in this particular diagram. So there's a huge surge, a huge lag time from the surge in LH to actual ovulation. And we see that consistently across all species. There's going to be a lag time there. And of course, at that point, LH is going to drop off. It's no longer needed. It surges and goes back up, goes up and immediately goes back down. That's a surge. And estrogen levels are going to also drop. Why? Because ovulation is taking place, and we've got luteinization of those granulosa cells, so no more estrogen will be produced, and so estrogen will drop off precipitously, and progesterone will start going up. Now, FSH is actually, and all these other hormones have gotten all the credit, but on this diagram, most stuff going on is relative to FSH. Let's go back. What is FSH's job? Folliculogenesis, right? Of course, granulosa cells will go along with that. So it's folliculogenesis. So if FSH is going up, what's happening in folliculogenesis? It's occurring. Follicle's getting bigger. Okay, that's fine. Makes sense. So what's happening from a folliculogenesis standpoint? What is happening right here? It is again, purple line. What's happening in proesters? Follicle's growing. Okay, makes sense. So your brain would think, well, okay, we need follicles grow, and once they reach their maximum size, and we're done with FSH, and all it drops, blah, blah, blah. That's not what happens. We see this consistently across species. We see a rise in FSH during proesters, and it may not always be in proesters depending on the species, but we see this rise in FSH, and then a drop in FSH, and then a subsequent rise in FSH. Now, two questions. Why? And what causes that change in the hormone level? Let's do the second first, because you should know that answer already. What causes this drop in FSH without affecting LH? Inhibin. So this point right here where FSH drops off is inhibin. That's doing it. The question is, though, why is this happening? Because at this point, we're actually not completely done with folliculogenesis. We're almost done with it. What is happening here, and however you want, and I would love to be able to draw on this. This is a fallacy of this classroom. I can't draw. If you want to draw a little circle around this purple line, however you want to differentiate it, but this is a period called follicular selection. What is happening here is and it's fairly random, but a certain group of follicles are being selected. I'm sorry, I'm told that backwards. Probably change that. Recruitment. That's the recruitment phase. Okay. A group of follicles are being recruited. Like, I got a group of football players. And some are good, some are bad, but let me just take my chances for right now. Let me recruit them all, right? But I'm going to ultimately sign all of them. I only have certain space for a certain number, so who am I going to select? I'm probably going to select the best ones. Okay? There's two phases here. Recruitment phase, it is basically recruiting a group of potential follicles. It's fairly random, but there's a group of follicles that are going to respond to this rising FSH levels. Now, are those follicles all going to ultimately wind up being ovulated? Well, no, obviously. But this is a recruitment process. So, what happens to that recruitment process at that point right there when inhibin causes this drop-off? Not yet. What happens when that FSH drops off? So I've got this pool of recruited follicles. They've grown. I'm like, oh, I want you. So you all grow. Rest of you, y'all just stay there. Y'all don't do anything. I don't want you right now. I want to recruit this group right here. And I want you to grow all about the same rate. But FSH just dropped off. What happens to my little group here, my recruited group here? What happens to it?
The only ones left.
It stops growing. It doesn't die. It just stops growing. Why? Because there's no FSH to stimulate it. They hang out there. What is that group of recruited follicles looking for? What are they looking for? They're looking for a rise in FSH. That rise in FSH is going to come. And when it happens, one of those follicles is going to be selected. Or if it's a multiple ovulator, however many they're going to ovulate. In the case of a cow, it would just be typically one. So when is this selection going to take place? If I look at this diagram. This rise right here. Right? So here, if I were to ask you, okay, what is the state at that point right there? What is the state of my recruited follicular pool? At that point right there. What's the state? Because our recruitment's already taking place, because this is recruitment here. We're growing our recruited pool right here. So what's the state of the recruited pool right there?
Waiting.
They're sitting there. They're not dead. They're not shrinking. They're just sitting there. What happens when this FSH starts to go back up? One, or depending again on the species, is going to be then selected. That's the one that is going to ultimately be ovulated. So you've got two different processes here. You've got recruitment, and then you've got selection here. And again, the selection could be one in the case of a single ovulator, or multiple ovulators. It could be several, depending again on the species. So recruitment and selection here. Does that make sense? So again, FSH is a lot going on. So you ask yourself the question, well, why do we even have this drop-off? Can't this happen? I don't know the answer to that question, but couldn't this just happen just without this drop-off? Well, not really, because what has to happen is you got to recruit them, and then they got to sit there, and then you got to punch one of them. That's basically what's happening. I mean, seriously, what's happening is you recruit this pool, and they're sitting there waiting on FSH, and then boom, one of them is responsive to that next rise in FSH, and it punches that one, and that's the one that's selected. And what happens to the rest of them? They're not selected. Sadly not. They kind of die. It's called atresia. They shrink away. Isn't that sad? It's a sad story.
So do they just go away, or do they just shrink back down?
They shrink. No, they go away. Atresia is when they literally go away. They have so many follicles coming behind, it doesn't make any difference on them. It seems kind of inefficient, right? But it's the way it works. So does that make sense? Recruitment pool, which is that first rise in FSH, then the drop off of FSH in response to inhibin, and then a rise in FSH to select that one, or again, it could be multiple depending on the animal, single ovulator versus multiple ovulator.
So what is the last rise?
Everybody always asks that. That one right there. Talking about what that. She asked what this little blip is. It really is. Let me put it a couple ways. This overstates it because of the way these graphs kind of shrunk. I'll say that much, but it does have a physiological purpose is that is actually, anytime you see, I love that punch analogy. I don't like to punch people, but I love that. Some people want to punch, but I won't get into that. But that punch analogy works pretty well because any time we see this little kind of rise in FSH, what that is that's punching follicles. It's like, wake up, wake up. That is actually a very, and again, it's all relative because see how the levels here are quite a bit higher. But this is a very early punch in the gut to the next round of follicles that were recruited as it goes back around here. Does that make sense? And you see another one right there. See it? These little, they're not even episodic blips. There's little short rises in FSH. It's almost like punch it, keep it alive. So they'll be ready for that next recruitment. So there is a physiological purpose to those rises in med-estrus and even in di-estrus of FSH. That's a good question. Okay. Do y'all understand all that? Do you have any questions about this? Put a star by this graph. This one's going to be important. I can ask a lot of questions off this one, so make sure you understand this particular graph. And be able to, I'm not going to ask you to put, necessarily label it or anything where the stuff happens, but I might ask you a question relative to where specific things are happening here and what they mean, okay? So make sure you can understand this graph and what's going on, not only from an endocrine standpoint, but what's also going on at the follicular level in these different phases on this graph. Again, most of it is pro-estrus. There's very little going on, honestly, in med-estrus or di-estrus relative to massive activity at the follicular level. Questions at all? Note also, ovulation very early med-estrus. So when I talk about bovine and caprine being in med-estrus, it's always very early med-estrus for what that's worth. Yeah.
So you said the one that gets punches for like the next round, not current?
This one right here now. Don't confuse it. That one right there, and anytime you see that little rise in med-estrus or di-estrus, that's for the next round of recruited follicles. Does that make sense?
And that's the group, right?
Yes, the recruited group, because it's always a recruited group, or pool, or however you want to use it. Anything else on this diagram? Okay. Do I keep going, or do I?
No.
Well, I'm gonna cover it all eventually, so it's like, do it now, do it next time. Let's do it next time. So next time we're going to spend the majority of time talking about two things. One is the physiology of seasonal breeders. Kisspeptin neurons is coming back to play. Yay. I think that's real quick. Seasonality, physiology of seasonal breeders, and the physiology of ovulation. Those are two big things for next week. Finish up these slides, and then you can go and rest your brain for a week away from